She stepped between a screaming manager and a terrified child, and got fired on the spot. What no one in that diner knew was that the man watching from the booth was the boy's father, and he never forgets a face. The question isn't what he did next, it's who he chose to destroy first. The breakfast shift at Riverside Diner hit its stride just after 8 a.m., when the truckers rolled in alongside the morning commuters. Jenny Matt wiped down the counter for the fourth time that hour, her worn sneakers squeaking against linoleum that had seen better decades. She balanced 3 plates of scrambled eggs on her left arm and a coffee pot in her right hand, weaving between red vinyl booths with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned long ago that tips didn't come from being friendly, they came from being fast. She'd been working at Riverside for 8 months, ever since her business management courses at community college had been cut short by her mother's medical bills. The irony wasn't lost on her. She could calculate profit margins and manage inventory systems, but she couldn't afford to finish the degree that would get her out of this place. So she smiled at customers who looked through her, pocketed singles alongside the occasional 5, and told herself it was temporary. That's when she noticed the boy. He couldn't have been older than 8, sitting alone in booth 7 with his hands wrapped around a glass of orange juice like it was the only solid thing in his world. Dark hair fell across his forehead, partially hiding eyes that were too wary, too watchful for a child. His clothes were nice, too nice for this neighborhood, a pressed button-down shirt and clean jeans that probably cost more than Jenny made in a week. But it was his posture that made her chest tighten, shoulders hunched forward, body angled toward the wall, like he was trying to take up as little space as possible. "Hey, sweetheart," Jenny said softly, approaching with what she hoped was a reassuring smile. "You doing okay there? Waiting for someone?" The boy nodded but didn't speak. His grip on the glass tightened. "That's all right. You want some toast or something while you wait?" "Maybe some." "What the hell is this?" Jenny turned at the sharp voice cutting across the diner. Mike George, the shift manager, was storming across the floor with the expression of a man who'd just found a rat in the kitchen. He'd been running Riverside for 3 years, ever since the owner had moved to Florida and left him in charge, and he'd been making everyone miserable ever since. "Excuse me, kid," Mike said, his voice carrying to every booth. "You order anything? You paying for that juice?" The boy's shoulders hunched further forward, and Jenny felt something hot and protective flare in her chest. "Mike, he's just..." "I'm not talking to you, Jenny." Mike's face was already flushing red, the way it always did when he sensed an opportunity to exert authority. He leaned over the booth, invading the boy's space. "I asked you a question, kid. Who are you here with?" "He's clearly waiting for someone," Jenny said, keeping her voice level despite the anger building in her throat. "He's not bothering anyone. He's taking up a booth during rush hour," Mike snapped. "This isn't a babysitting service. If he's not ordering food, he needs to." The boy flinched when Mike reached for his arm, and that's when Jenny stopped thinking. She moved without deciding to, stepping between Mike and the booth in one smooth motion. Her hand came up, not touching Mike, but creating a barrier, and she pointed directly at his chest. "Back away from him." The diner went quiet. Not the natural lull of conversation between bites, but the sudden, absolute silence that comes when everyone in a room realizes something serious is happening. Mike's face went from red to purple. "Excuse me?" "He's a child, Mike. Not a criminal." Jenny kept her voice steady, but she could feel her pulse hammering in her throat. "He spilled some juice and he's scared." "There's no reason to." "There's every reason." Mike's voice cracked with rage. "Do you know how many freeloaders try to camp out here? Do you know how hard it is to run a profitable business when he's 8 years old? I don't care if he's..." "Is there a problem?" The voice came from behind them. Quiet. Calm. Cold as January ice. The entire diner went from quiet to dead silent. Jenny turned. The man sitting in the corner booth, the one she'd barely noticed when she'd done her rounds 20 minutes ago, was standing now. He was tall, well over 6 feet, wearing a gray suit that looked like it cost more than Jenny's car. His shirt was black, expensive, and his face had the kind of hard angles that came from a life where violence was always an option. Dark eyes swept across the scene with the systematic precision of someone who missed nothing, catalogued everything, and forgot even less. Behind him, near the door, two other men in dark suits had appeared. Jenny hadn't seen them come in. They stood like sentries, hands clasped in front of them, faces expressionless. "Mister," Mike's voice came out strangled. All the color drained from his face in an instant. I wasn't aware." The Mafia boss walked forward with the unhurried confidence of a man who'd never been told no in his life. He moved past Jenny without looking at her and stopped beside booth 7. The boy looked up, and something in his terrified expression shifted. Not relief. Not quite. Something more complicated. "He's with me," the Mafia boss said quietly. The boy, his son, Jenny realized with a jolt, slid out of the booth slowly, his movements careful, controlled. He stood beside his father but didn't reach for him, didn't smile, didn't relax. "Of course," Mike stammered, his voice pitching higher with each word. "Of course, sir, I apologize for the confusion. If I'd known he was your son, I would have." "You'd have what?" The Mafia boss's voice was still quiet, but now it carried an edge that made every survival instinct Jenny possessed scream at her to back away. "Treated him like a human being? That's not supposed to be conditional, Mike." "No, sir. Absolutely not, sir." The Mafia boss finally looked at Jenny. She felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing, assessing, measuring, cataloging. He studied her face for a long moment, long enough that she became aware of the coffee stain on her uniform and the flyaway hairs escaping from her ponytail. "You," he said. "Sir. You defended him." It wasn't a question, but Jenny nodded anyway. He wasn't doing anything wrong. Something shifted in the Mafia boss's expression, too quick for her to identify. Then his son did something that made the entire diner hold its breath. The boy walked past his father and stood beside Jenny instead. His small hand reached out and grabbed the edge of her apron, the way a much younger child might cling to their mother. The Mafia boss looked at his son hiding behind a diner waitress instead of coming to him, and Jenny saw something crack in his carefully controlled expression. Not anger. Something deeper, something more painful than that. "Marco," he said softly. "Come here." The boy didn't move. His grip on Jenny's apron tightened. "It's okay," Jenny murmured, gently touching the boy's shoulder. "You should go with your dad." Marco looked up at her with eyes that held far too much sadness for an 8-year-old, then slowly walked back to his father. But he kept glancing back at Jenny. The Mafia boss noticed. "Mike," he said, still looking at Jenny. "You're fired." "What?" "But You're done. You have 10 minutes to clean out your office." The Mafia boss's attention shifted to Mike for just a second, and whatever Mike saw in those eyes made him go pale. "If you're still here in 11, my associates will help you leave. Permanently." Mike opened his mouth, closed it, then practically ran toward the back office. The Mafia boss looked at Jenny one more time. "What's your name?" "Jenny Matt, sir." He nodded once, then guided his son toward the door. The two men in suits fell into step behind them like shadows. Jenny stood frozen in the middle of the diner, her heart hammering, her hands shaking, her brain struggling to process what had just happened. The other waitress, Maria, appeared at her elbow. "Do you have any idea who that was?" "No," Jenny whispered. "That was the Mafia boss," Maria breathed, her voice dropping to barely audible. "That man controls half the businesses in this city." Jenny's knees went weak. She grabbed the edge of the nearest booth to steady herself. She'd just defended the son of the most dangerous man in the state. She'd just witnessed a man lose his job in front of a crime boss. She'd just done something that would either save her life or end it. And she had absolutely no idea which. The Mafia boss didn't speak during the drive back to the estate. He kept one hand on the steering wheel of the black Mercedes, the other resting on the center console, close enough to his son that Marco could reach for it if he wanted to. The boy didn't. He sat in the passenger seat with his seatbelt pulled tight across his chest, staring out the window at the passing buildings, his reflection ghost pale in the glass. The Mafia boss had seen men break under interrogation. He'd watched grown men weep and beg and sell out everyone they'd ever loved to buy themselves another hour of life. He knew fear in all its variations, the hot, desperate kind that made people stupid, and the cold, calculated kind that made them dangerous. But watching his 8-year-old son flinch away from a middle-aged manager in a roadside diner had hit differently. That particular flavor of fear, small, instinctive, bone deep, was something the Mafia boss couldn't fix with money or muscle or carefully applied pressure. He'd been sitting in that corner booth for 20 minutes before Mike George had made his move. The Mafia boss had been conducting business. Quiet conversations with men who understood that power didn't announce itself with volume. He'd told Marco to sit in a different booth, to order orange juice, to wait. It was supposed to be safe. Anonymous. Normal. Then the boy had knocked over his glass. The Mafia boss had watched the juice spread across the table. Had watched his son freeze, that terrible stillness that came from a child who'd learned that mistakes drew attention and attention drew pain. Marco's mother. The Mafia boss's late wife had been gone for 2 years now, and the boy had been withdrawing ever since, folding inward like paper held too close to flame. When Mike George had grabbed Marco's arm, the Mafia boss had been halfway out of his seat before he'd stopped himself. Moving too fast, reacting too visibly, that would have told everyone in that diner exactly who he was and what his son meant to him. Information like that was currency in his world. Leverage. A weapon that could be used against him. So he'd waited. Watched. Calculated. And then the waitress had stepped in. The Mafia boss replayed the moment in his mind, the way she'd moved without hesitation, putting her body between Mike and Marco. The way she'd pointed at Mike's chest, not touching him, smart, avoiding assault charges, but making her position unmistakably clear. The way her voice had stayed level even as her hands shook. She'd been terrified. He'd seen it in the tension of her shoulders, the rapid flutter of her pulse at her throat. But she'd done it anyway. The Mafia boss understood violence. He understood money, leverage, fear, and loyalty bought through careful calibration of reward and punishment. But courage, pure and profitable courage from someone with nothing to gain, that was rare enough to be interesting. Dad? Marco's voice was small, tentative. Yeah, kid. Is that lady going to be okay? The Mafia boss glanced at his son. Marco was still staring out the window, but his hands were twisted together in his lap, fingers knotted tight. Why wouldn't she be? Because. Marco's voice got even smaller. Because she made Mike mad. And she helped me. And people who help me sometimes. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The Mafia boss's jaw tightened. He'd built his empire on the principle that loyalty mattered more than fear, that you protected your people absolutely and destroyed your enemies completely. But he'd also made enemies. Lots of them. And Marco had learned, too young, too harshly, that being close to the Mafia boss's family could be dangerous. She's going to be fine, the Mafia boss said quietly. Better than fine. Marco finally looked at him, dark eyes wide and uncertain. Promise? The Mafia boss didn't make promises he couldn't keep. It was one of his rules. But he nodded anyway. Promise. Back at Riverside Diner, the lunch shift had devolved into barely controlled chaos. Mike George had cleared out his office in 8 minutes, stuffing personal items into a cardboard box while his hands shook so badly he dropped his coffee mug twice. He'd left through the back door without saying goodbye to anyone, and nobody had asked where he was going. The other waitress, Maria, had taken over Mike's duties by default, but she spent more time whispering to customers than taking orders. By noon, everyone in the diner knew some version of what had happened. By 2 p.m., the story had spread to 3 other restaurants on the same block. "I'm telling you, that man wasn't normal," Maria said to the line cook, her voice carrying through the kitchen pass-through. "Did you see those guys with him? Did you see the way Mike looked?" "I heard he owns half the restaurants in the city," the line cook replied. "I heard he's connected to..." "Don't." The older waitress, Dolores, who'd been working at Riverside for 15 years, cut him off sharply. "Don't say anything else. You don't know who's listening." The conversation died immediately. Jenny had finished her shift in a daze, her mind replaying the moment the Mafia boss's eyes had locked on hers. That assessing look, like he was taking apart a complicated machine and cataloging every component. She'd seen recognition there, not of her face, but of something deeper. Some quality he'd identified and filed away. Now, standing in her studio apartment as evening light faded through the single window, Jenny couldn't stop her hands from shaking. She'd tried making tea. Tried eating leftover takeout. Tried watching TV. Nothing worked. Her brain kept circling back to the same terrifying loop. "You interfered with a Mafia boss's son, asterisk. You made a scene in front of one of the most dangerous men in the state, asterisk. You cost someone their job in front of him, asterisk. He knows your name, asterisk." Her phone rang at 8:47 p.m., and Jenny nearly dropped it. Unknown number. She stared at the screen for 3 rings before answering. "Hello? Jenny Matt?" The voice was male, professionally neutral. "Yes? You're expected tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. at the following address." He rattled off a location Jenny didn't recognize, somewhere in the business district, blocks away from anything she could afford to be near. "Don't be late." "Wait, expected by who? What is this about?" But the line was already dead. Jenny sat down on her thrift store couch, the phone still pressed to her ear, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. She thought about running. About packing the few things she owned and disappearing into a different city, a different state, a different life. But she also thought about Marco's small hand gripping her apron. About the way he'd looked up at her with eyes that had seen too much and trusted too little. About the barely perceptible crack in the Mafia boss's expression when his son had chosen a stranger over him. Jenny had spent 8 months at Riverside Diner learning that the world didn't reward courage. It rewarded silence, compliance, and keeping your head down. But she defended that boy anyway. And now she was going to find out what that decision had cost her. She set an alarm for 7 a.m., knowing she wouldn't sleep. She was right. Jenny wore the only professional clothes she owned, black slacks that were 2 years old and a white blouse she'd ironed 3 times to get the creases right. She stood outside the address she'd been given, staring up at a building that didn't belong in this neighborhood. Everything around it was aging brick and faded signage, but this structure was glass and steel and the kind of quiet wealth that didn't need to announce itself. A brass plaque beside the entrance read, "Costello Hospitality Group." No logo. No advertising. Just the name and an address. Jenny checked her phone, 9:53 a.m. Her hands were still shaking. They'd been shaking since she'd woken up at 5:30 a.m. after 2 hours of fractured sleep filled with dreams of dark-suited men and corner booths and a child's hand gripping her apron. She'd spent the early morning hours Googling the Mafia boss's name and finding almost nothing. A few business registrations. Some property records. One newspaper article from 6 years ago about a restaurant opening, featuring a photo of a man in an expensive suit cutting a ribbon, his face turned slightly away from the camera. The internet had been scrubbed clean. That told her more than any article could have. Jenny climbed the 3 steps to the entrance. Before she could reach for the handle, the door opened from inside. The man standing there was one of the 2 who'd been at the diner. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark suit that did nothing to hide the shape of the weapon beneath his jacket. His face was impassive, professional. "Miss Matt," he said. Not a question. "Yes." This way. The lobby was all marble and recessed lighting, the kind of minimalist design that cost more than it looked like it should. A receptionist sat behind a curved desk, her expression polite and distant. She didn't look up as Jenny passed. The guard led her to an elevator, pressed the button for the top floor, and said nothing during the ride up. Jenny watched the numbers climb, 3, 4, 5, 6, and tried to control her breathing. She'd read somewhere that controlling your breath could control your fear. It wasn't working. The elevator opened directly into an office suite. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the city, and the furniture was the kind of expensive simplicity that made Jenny acutely aware of her worn shoes and off-brand purse. Another guard stood beside a heavy wooden door, hands clasped in front of him. "He's expecting you," the first guard said, gesturing toward the door. Jenny's throat was dry. "Should I just go in?" She crossed the space on legs that felt disconnected from her body. The guard opened the door for her, and Jenny stepped inside. The office was quieter than it should have been, the kind of silence that came from soundproofing and distance from anything resembling normal life. The Mafia boss sat behind a desk position to catch the natural light from the windows, but his face remained partially shadowed. He was reading something on a tablet, his attention focused, unhurried. He didn't look up immediately. Jenny stood just inside the door, her heart hammering, waiting. Finally, the Mafia boss set the tablet aside and met her eyes. "Sit down, Miss Matt." It wasn't a request, but his tone was level. Calm. Nothing in his voice suggested immediate danger, which somehow made Jenny more nervous. She moved to one of the two chairs facing his desk and sat, keeping her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. The Mafia boss studied her for a long moment, the same assessing look from the diner, but longer now, more thorough. Jenny forced herself not to look away. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked. Jenny's voice came out steadier than she expected. "No, sir. You intervened yesterday. Protected my son." He leaned back slightly in his chair. Most people wouldn't have done that. He was scared. Mike was. Jenny stopped herself. He was being cruel to a child. Mike George has been fired from every management position he's held in the past 7 years, the Mafia boss said. He's been sued twice for workplace harassment. He has a documented history of abusing his authority, particularly with people who can't fight back. He paused. "I knew all of this when I walked into that diner." Jenny's breath caught. "You knew?" "I own Riverside Diner, Miss Matt. I own 12 others like it across the state. I know exactly who I employ and why." His expression didn't change. "I was there conducting other business. My son was supposed to wait quietly, order juice, be invisible. Instead, he made a mistake. Spilled his drink, and drew attention. He's 8 years old," Jenny said, the words coming out before she could stop them. "Children make mistakes." "Yes." Something shifted in the Mafia boss's face, subtle, but there. "They do." And Mike George saw an opportunity to assert power over someone vulnerable. He didn't know whose son he was targeting, but that shouldn't have mattered. "It didn't matter to you." Jenny didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. "I watched you defend Marco," the Mafia boss continued. "I watched you put your job at risk for a child you didn't know. I watched you stand between him and a man who outranked you, who could fire you, who did fire you, and you did it anyway." He leaned forward slightly. "Do you know what that tells me? That I'm impulsive?" Jenny's voice cracked slightly. "That I don't think before I act? That you have integrity?" The Mafia boss's gaze didn't waver. "That's rare. Especially in my world." Jenny's hands tightened in her lap. "Your world?" "I run a business empire, Miss Matt. Restaurants, real estate, hospitality ventures. Most of it is legitimate. All of it requires people I can trust." He paused. "I've spent 20 years building systems based on loyalty, on rewarding people who do the right thing even when it costs them something. But finding people who actually embody that? That's difficult. Jenny's brain was struggling to process this. I don't understand. You brought me here to tell me about your business philosophy? I brought you here to offer you a job. The words hung in the air between them. Jenny stared at him, certain she'd misheard. A job, she repeated slowly. I need someone to oversee internal operations across my restaurant division. Someone who can evaluate managers, assess workplace culture, identify problems before they escalate. The Mafia boss pulled a file from his desk drawer and slid it across to her. Someone with your background would be perfect. Jenny opened the file with trembling hands. Inside was a printout of her community college transcript, her partial degree in business management, her employment history for the past 3 years. Every job, every address, every detail of her life mapped out in black and white. How did you? I'm thorough, Miss Matt. His tone remained even. You stopped attending classes 2 years ago when your mother was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. You've been working 2 jobs since then to cover her medical bills and your own rent. You're smart, capable, and you've been wasted serving coffee to people who don't remember your name. Jenny's hands were shaking so badly the papers rustled. This is insane. You don't know me. You don't know if I'm qualified or... You defended my son without knowing who I was, without expecting anything in return, without even thinking about the consequences. The Mafia boss's voice dropped slightly. That makes you more qualified than half the people I employ. Jenny looked up from the file, meeting his eyes directly. And if I say no? Then you walk out of here, and nothing happens to you. He said it simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. I don't operate through fear, Miss Matt. I'm offering you an opportunity because I think you'd be good at it and because I owe you a debt. My son felt safe with you. That's not something money can buy. Jenny's mind raced through possibilities, consequences, dangers she couldn't even name yet. This was insane. This was stepping into a world she didn't understand with a man whose reputation existed in carefully scrubbed internet searches and warnings whispered in diner kitchens. But she also thought about her mother's medical bills. About the studio apartment with the leaking ceiling. About 2 years of her life spent serving people who looked through her like she was furniture. What exactly would this job entail? She asked quietly. The Mafia boss almost smiled. Almost. Smart question. Let's discuss details. Jenny closed the file and met his gaze. She was about to step into something dangerous. But she was also about to step into something that might finally change her life. All right, she said. I'm listening. Jenny's first week inside Costello Hospitality Group felt like learning to swim by being thrown into the deep end of a pool she couldn't see the bottom of. Her office was on the 5th floor, smaller than the Mafia boss's suite but still larger than her entire apartment. It had a desk, a computer with access to financial systems she was still learning to navigate, and a window that looked out over the city's business district. The salary was triple what she'd made at Riverside. The health insurance covered her mother's treatments without the crushing co-pays that had been eating her alive for 2 years. It should have felt like a miracle. Instead, it felt like standing on ice that could crack at any moment. These are the weekly P&L statements for all 12 diner locations, said Thomas, the finance director who'd been assigned to train her. He was 50-something, gray-haired, and had the expressionless face of a man who'd learned long ago not to ask questions about things that didn't concern him. He dropped a stack of spreadsheets on her desk. You'll review these every Monday. Look for anomalies, unusual expenses, inventory discrepancies, payroll irregularities. Jenny picked up the first report. Riverside Diner's numbers from last month. Revenue, costs, profit margins. All laid out in columns that should have made sense but somehow didn't quite add up. What kind of anomalies? She asked. You'll know them when you see them. Thomas's tone was carefully neutral. If something looks off, flag it. Don't investigate it yourself. Just flag it and move it up the chain. Up the chain meaning? Meaning you tell me, I tell the Mafia boss, and he decides what happens next. Thomas met her eyes for the first time that morning. That's important, Miss Matt. You see something, you report it. You don't try to solve it. You don't ask other employees about it. You don't discuss it with anyone except me or him. Understand? Jenny understood that she was being given a warning disguised as instruction. Understood, she said. Thomas nodded and left her alone with the spreadsheets. By day 3, Jenny had toured 8 of the 12 diners. They were all similar to Riverside. Mid-range establishments in working-class neighborhoods, the kind of places where truckers ate breakfast and families grabbed dinner on paydays. The kitchens were clean, the staff was efficient, and the food was decent if unexceptional. But there was something underneath the normalcy that Jenny couldn't quite identify. A tension in the way managers straightened when she walked in. A careful quality to the way employees answered her questions, like they were measuring every word before speaking. At the 4th location, a diner in South Point called Rosie's, the general manager, a woman named Patricia, had given her a tour that was almost aggressively thorough. She'd shown Jenny the walk-in freezer, the storage areas, the employee break room, talking the entire time about inventory rotation and scheduling efficiency. Everything's clean, Patricia had said, her smile too bright. No problems here. We run a tight ship. The emphasis on those last 6 words had been slight, but it was there. Jenny had thanked her and left feeling like she'd just passed some kind of test she hadn't known she was taking. The Mafia boss himself was a ghost presence in her first week. She saw him exactly twice, once in the elevator, where he'd nodded at her without speaking, and once through the glass wall of a conference room where he'd been meeting with 3 men in expensive suits. He'd glanced up as she passed, made eye contact for exactly 2 seconds, then returned his attention to the meeting. Both times, Jenny had felt the weight of assessment in that brief look. Like he was measuring whether she was adapting, whether she was learning, whether she was worth the investment he'd made in her. On Friday afternoon, she found the first irregularity. It was small, easy to miss if you weren't looking carefully. Riverside Diner's supply orders for the past 3 months showed consistent purchases from a vendor called Summit Food Services. The invoices were professionally formatted, the amounts reasonable, the delivery schedules regular. But when Jenny cross-referenced the vendor name with the approved supplier list Thomas had given her, Summit Food Services wasn't on it. She pulled up the invoices again, studying the details. The food costs were slightly higher than other locations. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to make a difference over time. 10% higher on produce. 15% on dry goods. 20% on meat. Jenny did the math. Over 3 months, the overcharges came to roughly $18,000. She sat back in her chair, staring at the screen. This could be a legitimate vendor that somehow hadn't been added to the master list. Or it could be something else. Something worth flagging. She was reaching for her phone to call Thomas when her office door opened without a knock. The woman who entered was maybe 35, wearing a black pencil skirt and heels that made her nearly 6 feet tall. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and her expression was the professional neutrality Jenny had seen on every other employee in this building. "Miss Matt," the woman said. "I'm Diane. I work in vendor relations." Oh. Jenny hadn't known vendor relations was a department. "I know what you were looking at." Diane closed the door behind her and walked to Jenny's desk. She didn't sit. "Summit Food Services supplies 3 of our locations. They're legitimate. Pre-approved by management. They're not on my supplier list," Jenny said carefully. "That's an outdated list. Thomas should have mentioned that." Diane's smile was professional and completely empty. "I'll send you the updated version. Summit's been working with us for 8 months. No issues." 8 months. That meant they'd been supplying Riverside since before Jenny had started working there. Since before Mike George had been fired. "I'll make a note of it," Jenny said, not moving to close the spreadsheet. Thank you for clarifying. Diane nodded and turned to leave. She had her hand on the door when she paused and looked back. Word of advice, Miss Matt. This company runs smoothly because everyone stays in their lane. You're here to review reports and flag obvious problems. But you're also new. It's easy to see patterns that aren't really there when you're still learning the systems. Her tone stayed professional, but something in her eyes had gone cold. Give it a few more weeks before you start questioning vendors that have been vetted by people who've been here a lot longer than you have. She left before Jenny could respond. Jenny sat in the silence of her office, staring at the closed door, her heart beating faster than it should. That hadn't been advice. That had been a warning. She looked back at her computer screen. Summit Food Services. $18,000 in overcharges. A vendor that appeared on invoices but not on approved supplier lists. And Diane, who'd appeared within minutes of Jenny finding the discrepancy, as if someone had been watching her screen. Jenny saved the spreadsheet, locked her computer, and stood up. She needed to tell Thomas. That was the protocol. But first, she needed to understand exactly what she'd just found. And why someone had been so quick to try and make her ignore it. Jenny spent the weekend doing something she'd been explicitly told not to do, investigating on her own. She sat at her apartment's small kitchen table with her laptop and 3 months of financial records she'd downloaded to a thumb drive before leaving work Friday. Technically, this probably violated half a dozen company policies. Possibly some laws. But Diane's warning had lodged itself in Jenny's brain like a splinter, and she couldn't leave it alone. Give it a few more weeks before you start questioning vendors, asterisk. Translation, stop looking. Jenny had spent 2 years of her life learning that when someone told you to stop looking, it usually meant there was something worth finding. She started with Summit Food Services. The invoices were professionally formatted, company letterhead, itemized charges, payment terms. But the address listed was a commercial mailbox facility, not a warehouse or distribution center. The phone number went to a voicemail that never got returned. Jenny pulled up business registration records. Summit Food Services had been registered 8 months ago by a management company that owned 17 other shell corporations, all with generic names: Apex Solutions, Pinnacle Enterprises, Sterling Associates. None of them seemed to actually do anything. She traced the payment history. Every invoice from Summit was approved by the same person, Mike George, in his capacity as Regional Operations Manager, a position he'd held before being moved to direct management of Riverside Diner. Jenny's hands stilled on the keyboard. Mike had been fired a week ago. But these invoices were still being processed, still being paid, still flowing through the system under his old authorization codes. She pulled up personnel records. Something she technically had access to but hadn't needed until now. Mike George's employment file was thicker than it should be. 5 positions in 3 years, each one ending with a transfer rather than termination. Notes from HR about interpersonal conflicts and management style concerns. 2 formal complaints that had been resolved with mandatory training and reassignment. The Mafia boss had said Mike had a history. Looking at this file, Jenny understood that history was an understatement. She dug deeper into the financial records, expanding her search beyond Riverside to the other locations Mike had managed. The pattern was there once she knew to look for it: vendors that appeared and disappeared, supply costs that ran 10 to 20% higher than comparable locations, inventory discrepancies that balanced out on paper but made no practical sense. Mike hadn't just been skimming. He'd been running a systematic operation across multiple locations for years. Jenny was reaching for her phone to call Thomas, protocol demanded it, and she'd already crossed enough lines, when her laptop chimed with an incoming email. The sender was an address she didn't recognize, a string of numbers and letters at a free email service. No subject line. She almost deleted it as spam, but something made her click it open. Inside was a single attachment, an audio file. Jenny hesitated, then clicked play. The recording was grainy, like it had been captured on a phone from across a room. But the voices were clear enough. Telling you, this is the perfect setup. That was Mike George's voice, slightly distorted but unmistakable. The old man thinks he's untouchable. Thinks nobody would dare move against his kid. And you're sure about the diner? A second voice, male, unfamiliar. You're sure he'll be there? He does the same route every week. Stops at Riverside, conducts his business, keeps his kid nearby so nobody tries anything in public. It's actually pretty smart, except it makes him predictable. So what's the play? The play is I make a scene. Embarrass the kid, push hard enough that the old man has to react. He loses his temper in public, gets violent in front of witnesses. That's the kind of footage the feds would love to have. Hell, the Calabrese family would pay 6 figures just for proof that he's unstable. Jenny's breath caught. The Calabrese family. She didn't know much about organized crime, but she knew that name. They were rivals, the kind of rivals where territories mattered and succession wars turned bloody. Mike's voice continued, best case, we get him on video committing assault. Worst case, we get proof he's putting his kid in dangerous situations, and CPS gets involved. Either way, he loses face, loses leverage, and loses control. And the waitress? What waitress? The one who'll be working that section. You're going to make a scene in the middle of a rush. Someone's going to intervene. Mike laughed, and the sound made Jenny's skin crawl. Then they get fired and forgotten. Collateral damage. Nobody's going to remember some waitress who couldn't mind her own business. The recording ended. Jenny sat frozen, staring at her laptop screen, her mind racing through implications. Mike hadn't just been stealing. He'd been deliberately provoking the Mafia boss, trying to manufacture a violent incident that could be used against him. The diner confrontation hadn't been about Marco spilling juice or taking up space in a booth. It had been a trap. And Jenny had walked right into the middle of it. She pulled up the email again, looking for any identifying information about who'd sent it. Nothing. The metadata was scrubbed, the sender anonymous. Someone wanted her to know the truth. But why? And who? Jenny's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. You're asking the right questions. But Mike George is just one piece. Check the vendor payments from South Point, same pattern, different name. He's not working alone, asterisk. Jenny stared at the message, her heart hammering. Someone was watching her investigation. Someone who knew what she was looking for and wanted her to find it. She pulled up the South Point financial records with shaking hands. The location Patricia had smiled through, where everything was supposedly perfect. There it was, another phantom vendor. Different name, same structure. Sterling Associates, registered to the same management company as Summit Food Services. 7 months of inflated invoices, all approved by Mike George before his transfer. But there was something else. Payments that went out to Sterling didn't just stop when Mike was fired, they'd been redirected. The new authorization codes belonged to someone else, someone currently working in vendor relations. Jenny pulled up the employee directory, cross-referencing the codes. The name that appeared made her stomach drop, Diane. The woman who'd walked into Jenny's office to warn her off Summit Food Services was the same person now approving payments to its sister company. Jenny sat back in her chair, her mind spinning through connections. Mike had built the framework, the shell companies, the inflated invoices, the systematic theft. But he hadn't been working alone. He'd had help inside the company, someone with access to vendor systems and payment authorizations. Someone who was still there. Someone who'd been worried enough about Jenny's investigation to try and shut it down immediately. Jenny's phone buzzed again. Another text from the same unknown number. Mike tried to burn down the empire from inside. He failed. But his partner is still there, and she's more dangerous than he ever was. Watch your back, asterisk. Jenny looked at the message, then at her laptop screen with its web of financial records and shell companies and theft that ran deeper than she'd imagined. She'd thought she was investigating a simple case of vendor fraud. Instead, she'd stumbled into something much bigger. A conspiracy that had been running for months, involving multiple people, multiple locations, and an attempt to manipulate the Mafia boss into a public incident that would destroy his reputation and his business. And now that she knew about it, Jenny realized with cold certainty, she'd made herself a target. She needed to tell the Mafia boss. Immediately. But first, she needed to figure out exactly how deep this betrayal went, and who else might be involved. Because if Diane was dirty, and Mike had been planning this for months, there was no way they were the only ones. Jenny saved everything to 3 separate thumb drives, shut down her laptop, and sat in her dark apartment with her heart racing. She'd stepped into the Mafia boss's world thinking she was here to evaluate managers and fix workplace culture. Instead, she'd uncovered evidence of a conspiracy designed to destroy him. And somewhere out there, someone was watching her discover it, and sending her breadcrumbs to follow even deeper into the darkness. Monday morning, Jenny walked into her office to find the Mafia boss sitting in her chair. He wasn't doing anything threatening, just sitting there, reading something on his phone, backlit by the morning sun coming through her window. But the sight of him in her space, occupying her territory without invitation or explanation, sent her pulse skyrocketing. "Sir," she managed, stopping in the doorway. The Mafia boss looked up, his expression unreadable. "Close the door." Jenny did, her hand trembling slightly on the handle. She stayed standing, her laptop bag gripped against her chest like a shield. "You took files home this weekend," the Mafia boss said. Not a question. A statement of fact. Jenny's stomach dropped. Of course he knew. The building probably had monitoring software on every computer, tracking every download, every login, every action. "I did," she said, forcing her voice steady. "I found irregularities in the vendor payments. I wanted to. I told you to flag issues and move them up the chain." His tone remained level, but there was something underneath it now. Something that made Jenny's survival instinct scream. "I didn't tell you to conduct independent investigations or download confidential financial records to unsecured personal devices. I know. I'm sorry. But I found something, and I needed to." "To what?" The Mafia boss stood, and even though he didn't move toward her, Jenny felt the space in the room shrink. "To prove you were smarter than my finance director? To show me you could solve problems I didn't ask you to solve?" Jenny's hands tightened on her laptop bag. This was a test. Everything was a test with him. The question was whether she was supposed to back down or stand her ground. She chose the truth. "To prove I could be trusted with the real problems," she said quietly. "Not just the sanitized version you show new employees." Something flickered in the Mafia boss's expression, too quick to identify. He studied her for a long moment, then walked past her to the door. "My office. 10 minutes. Bring everything you found." He left without waiting for a response. Jenny stood alone in her office, her heart hammering, trying to decide if she'd just passed his test or failed it catastrophically. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Jenny laid out everything: the shell companies, the inflated invoices, Mike's recorded conversation, the connection to Diane. She'd brought printed documentation, spreadsheets highlighted with discrepancies, timelines that showed the systematic nature of the theft. The Mafia boss listened without interrupting. Thomas was there too, his face growing progressively paler as Jenny spoke. By the time she finished, he looked like he might be sick. "How long have you known about this?" the Mafia boss asked Thomas, his voice dangerously quiet. "I didn't," Thomas swallowed hard. "I trusted the vendor relations department. Diane's been here for 4 years. Her background checks were clean. I had no reason to." "That's not what I asked." Thomas went silent, which was answer enough. The Mafia boss turned back to Jenny. The audio recording. Where did it come from? I don't know. It was sent anonymously. And the texts directing you to look at South Point? Same unknown number. Untraceable. Which means someone inside this organization wants you to find this information but doesn't want to be identified. The Mafia boss leaned back in his chair. That's either very helpful or very dangerous. Possibly both. Jenny hadn't thought about it that way. You think it's a setup? I think you've been here 2 weeks and you've already uncovered a conspiracy that's been running for 8 months under the noses of people who've worked for me for years. His eyes never left her face. That's either because you're exceptionally competent or because someone is using you as a clean proxy to expose their rivals. The thought made Jenny's blood run cold. So what do we do? She asked. We? The Mafia boss's eyebrow raised slightly. You've done your job, Miss Matt. You flagged the issue. You moved it up the chain. This is where you step back and let me handle it. But his tone suggested he was testing her again. Seeing if she'd take the easy exit or insist on staying involved. Jenny thought about her studio apartment and her mother's medical bills and the very strong possibility that she was about to do something monumentally stupid. With respect, sir, I found this. I know the details. And whoever sent me that information trusts me, or at least trusts me more than they trust whoever else they could have sent it to. She met his eyes directly. If you shut me out now, you lose that connection. The Mafia boss almost smiled. You're either very brave or very stupid, Miss Matt. Probably both, Jenny admitted. This time he did smile, brief and sharp. All right. You're in. But from this point forward, you tell me everything you find the moment you find it. No more independent investigations. No more taking files home. And for God's sake, no more responding to anonymous texts without clearing it with me first. Understood. Good. Now get out. I need to have a conversation with Thomas about departmental oversight. Jenny stood, gathering her materials. Thomas looked at her with something between gratitude and resentment. She'd exposed the problem but also exposed his failure to catch it. She was almost to the door when the Mafia boss spoke again. Miss Matt. She turned back. You did good work, he said quietly. But you've also just made yourself visible to people who don't want to be caught. Be careful. That afternoon, Jenny was reviewing payroll records when her desk phone rang. Internal extension. Miss Matt? This is Rebecca from reception. There's someone here to see you. Says his name is Marco. Jenny's heart jumped. Send him up. 5 minutes later, the Mafia boss's son appeared in her doorway, accompanied by one of the ever-present security guards. Marco looked small in his school uniform, a backpack slung over one shoulder, his dark eyes uncertain. Hi, Jenny said gently. This is a surprise. Dad said I could visit if I wanted. Marco's voice was quiet. If you're not too busy. I'm never too busy for you. Jenny cleared space at her desk. Come on in. The guard took position outside the door, giving them privacy but staying close enough to intervene if needed. Marco sat in one of the chairs across from Jenny's desk, his feet not quite touching the floor. How's school? Jenny asked. Okay. Marco fidgeted with his backpack strap. We're learning about fractions. Those are tricky. You need help? No. I'm good at math. He was quiet for a moment, then, I wanted to say thank you. For what you did at the diner. You already thanked me, remember? No, I mean. Marco struggled with the words. Nobody ever does that. Stands up for me. Most people are either scared of my dad or they want something from him, so they're nice to me because they think it'll help them. But you didn't know who he was. You just helped. Jenny's throat tightened. You're a good kid, Marco. You deserve to be defended. My mom used to say that. His voice got even quieter. That everyone deserves kindness. Even when people are mean to them. Your mom sounds like she was a smart woman. She was. Marco looked up, and Jenny saw tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. I miss her. I bet you do. Jenny came around the desk and sat in the chair beside him. It's okay to miss her. It's okay to be sad. Marco nodded, wiping at his eyes quickly. They sat in silence for a moment, then he said, Dad's different when you're around. Less hard. Jenny didn't know what to say to that. I like when you're at our house, Marco continued. It feels safer. Before Jenny could respond, her phone buzzed. A text from the unknown number. Mike George is meeting someone tonight. 9 p.m. Warehouse District, 4th and Morrison. He's selling information to the Calabrese family. This is your proof, asterisk. Jenny stared at the screen, her mind racing. Marco noticed. Is something wrong? No, Jenny lied. Just work stuff. But it wasn't just work stuff. It was confirmation that Mike was still active, still dangerous, still trying to burn down everything the Mafia boss had built. And whoever was sending these messages was giving Jenny the opportunity to catch him in the act. She could tell the Mafia boss. Follow protocol. Let him handle it. Or she could go herself, get proof, and end this before Mike could do any more damage. Marco was watching her with those two old eyes, eyes that had seen his mother die and his father carry the weight of an empire built on violence and control. Eyes that had finally started to trust someone again. Jenny made her decision. Marco, I need to go talk to your dad about something. But I'm really glad you came to visit. Can I come back? Anytime you want. After Marco left with his guard, Jenny sat at her desk and pulled up the address from the text. 4th and Morrison. The Warehouse District. Not exactly a place you went after dark unless you were looking for trouble. She should tell the Mafia boss. She knew that. But part of her needed to see this for herself. Needed to know for certain that Mike was the threat she believed he was. Needed evidence that couldn't be questioned or dismissed. Jenny looked at the time, 4:30 p.m. 4.5 hours until the meeting. She grabbed her phone and texted back. I'll be there, asterisk. The response came immediately. Come alone. If Mike sees security, he'll run. And Jenny? Be careful. These people don't play by the same rules you do, asterisk. Jenny stared at the message, her heart pounding. She was about to do something dangerous. Possibly lethal. But if she could get proof of Mike's betrayal, if she could protect Marco and the Mafia boss and everything they were building, it was worth the risk. She hoped. Jenny didn't go to the warehouse. She'd gotten as far as her car in the parking garage, keys in hand, when she'd stopped and really thought about what she was about to do. Walk into the warehouse district at night, alone, to spy on a meeting between a disgraced manager and members of an organized crime family. She'd sat in her car for 10 minutes, engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel, before finally accepting the truth: going alone was suicide. But she still needed proof. Jenny had driven back upstairs, walked past her own office, and knocked on the Mafia boss's door at 8:45 p.m. He'd been there, working late, the way she'd gambled he would be. When she'd told him about the text and the meeting, she'd expected anger. Expected to be shut out, maybe fired, possibly worse. Instead, he'd looked at her for a long moment and said, "Show me the messages." 20 minutes later, they were in an unmarked car 3 blocks from the warehouse at 4th and Morrison, the Mafia boss behind the wheel and 2 of his security team in a second vehicle nearby. Jenny sat in the passenger seat with a camera that had a telephoto lens she barely knew how to operate. "You're sure about the time?" the Mafia boss asked, his voice quiet in the darkness. "That's what the message said. 9 p.m. And you still don't know who's sending these?" "No, sir." He was silent for a moment, watching the warehouse entrance. "Whoever it is has been right about everything so far. That makes them either very well informed or very involved." Jenny had been thinking the same thing. Could it be someone inside Mike's operation? Someone who wants out? Maybe. Or someone who wants to take his place and needs us to eliminate the competition. The Mafia boss glanced at her. "In my world, Miss Matt, information is never free. Someone always wants something." At 8:57 p.m., a dark sedan pulled up to the warehouse. Mike George got out, looking around nervously before heading inside through a side entrance. He was carrying a messenger bag. "That'll be the documents," Jenny said. "Financial records, employee information, whatever he's selling." The Mafia boss's expression was unreadable. "Get ready with that camera." At 9:03, 2 more vehicles arrived, expensive SUVs with tinted windows. 4 men got out, wearing suits that probably cost more than Jenny made in a month. Even from 3 blocks away, she could tell they moved like people who were used to violence. Jenny raised the camera, her hands shaking slightly, and started taking photos. License plates. Faces. The men entering the warehouse. She got 15 clear shots before they disappeared inside. "Calabrese soldiers," the Mafia boss said quietly, and something in his tone made Jenny's blood run cold. "The tall one with the scar is Vincent Calabrese's nephew. This isn't just information trading. This is a formal negotiation." They waited. Jenny's heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. Minutes crawled by like hours. Then her phone buzzed. Another text from the unknown number. "You have your proof. Now get out of here. What happens next isn't something you need to see." Jenny showed the Mafia boss the message. He read it, then looked back at the warehouse. "Smart advice," he said. "But I want to know what they're negotiating. How are we going to?" He was already dialing his phone. "Position," he said when someone answered. A pause. "Good. Audio only. Don't move unless I tell you to." He hung up and glanced at Jenny. "I've had people inside that warehouse since 7 p.m. They're wired. We'll hear everything." Jenny stared at him. "You knew about this meeting before I told you." "I suspected. Your anonymous friend confirmed it." He pulled out a small device, a receiver, and turned up the volume. Static, then voices crackling through. "Telling you, the old man's operation is more vulnerable than it looks." That was Mike's voice, tense and eager. "He's got holes everywhere. The vendor scam was just the start. I can give you supplier lists, property records, protection payment schedules. And what do you want in return?" A different voice, rougher, with an accent Jenny couldn't place. "Protection. And a cut when you move on his territory. 10%. Laughter. 10%? You overestimate your value, Mr. George. I know where his son goes to school." Mike's voice dropped. "I know his security rotations, his travel patterns, his meeting schedules. I know which judges are on his payroll and which cops look the other way. That's worth 10%. Silence on the recording. Then, 5%. And only if the information proves valuable. Deal." The Mafia boss's expression hadn't changed, but Jenny saw his hand tighten on the steering wheel, the only outward sign of the rage that must have been building inside him. "We have enough," he said quietly, turning off the receiver. He made another call. "Pull back. Let them leave." I want surveillance on all of them, where they go, who they talk to. And get me everything we just recorded in a format I can use. He started the car and pulled away from the curb, driving in the opposite direction of the warehouse. Where are we going? Jenny asked. Somewhere Mike George will feel safe. The Mafia boss glanced at her. You did good tonight, Miss Matt. Better than good. You gave me exactly what I needed. What happens now? Now we set a different kind of trap. His voice was calm, almost pleasant, which somehow made it more frightening. Mike thinks he's won. He thinks he's found allies who'll protect him from me. He thinks he's sold information valuable enough to buy his safety. And he's wrong? He's very wrong. The Mafia boss turned onto the highway, heading back toward the city. Tomorrow morning, you're going to call Mike. Tell him you want to meet. Tell him you found irregularities in the vendor records and you think someone's setting him up. Tell him you want to help clear his name. Jenny's stomach dropped. He'll never believe that. He'll believe it because he thinks you're naive. He thinks you're just a waitress who got lucky, who doesn't understand how this world really works. The Mafia boss's eyes met hers briefly. Let him keep thinking that. Get him to agree to meet you. Somewhere public, somewhere he'll feel safe. And then? Then we have a conversation about loyalty. The Mafia boss's voice went colder. All three of us. The meeting was set for Wednesday at 2 p.m., in a private dining room above one of the Mafia boss's upscale restaurants in the financial district. Mike had been suspicious at first, but Jenny had played her role perfectly, concerned, naive, wanting to help because she felt bad that he'd been fired over a misunderstanding. I just think there's been a mistake, she told him on the phone. The vendor records don't make sense, and I think someone's trying to make you look bad. I want to help, but I need you to walk me through the system so I can understand it. Mike had agreed. Of course he had. He thought she was a fool. Now Jenny stood in the private dining room with its mahogany table and leather chairs and windows that looked out over the city. The Mafia boss was already there, standing by the window with his back to the door, hands in his pockets. He'll be here in 5 minutes, Jenny said, checking her phone. Good. The Mafia boss turned to face her. When he arrives, let him think this is your meeting. Let him think you're in charge. I'll just be here as an observer, there because you insisted on having a witness to keep things professional. And then? Then we see how he reacts when he realizes he's been caught. The Mafia boss walked to the head of the table and sat down. Fear makes people honest, Miss Matt. We're about to find out just how honest Mike George can be. Jenny's phone buzzed. A text from reception, Mr. George is on his way up. She looked at the Mafia boss. He was perfectly calm, perfectly still, like he was about to conduct a routine business meeting instead of confronting a man who tried to destroy him. Are you ready? He asked. Jenny nodded, even though her heart was hammering and her hands were shaking and every survival instinct she possessed was screaming at her to run. Footsteps in the hallway. Getting closer. The door opened. Mike George walked in, and he was smiling. Jenny, he said, his voice warm and friendly. Thanks for reaching out. I was hoping someone would finally start asking the right questions about what really happened. Then he saw the Mafia boss sitting at the head of the table. The smile died on his face. Hello, Mike, the Mafia boss said quietly. Why don't you have a seat? We have a lot to discuss. Mike's eyes darted to the door, calculating distance, calculating chances. The Mafia boss's security stepped into the doorway, blocking the exit. Mike's face went white. Sit down, the Mafia boss repeated, and this time it wasn't a suggestion. Mike sat. And Jenny realized the real confrontation was about to begin. Mike sat in the leather chair like a man sitting in an electric chair, waiting for the switch to flip. His hands gripped the armrests, knuckles white, eyes darting between Jenny and the Mafia boss like he was trying to calculate which direction the attack would come from. The Mafia boss said nothing. He simply opened a manila folder on the table in front of him and slid the first document across to Mike. "Do you know what this is?" the Mafia boss asked, his voice conversational, almost pleasant. Mike looked at the paper. Jenny could see his throat work as he swallowed. It looks like an invoice. It's an invoice from Summit Food Services. A company that doesn't exist. A company registered to a shell corporation that you created 8 months ago. The Mafia boss slid another document across. "Here's the business registration. Your signature is right there at the bottom." That's not," Mike's voice cracked. "I didn't sign that. Someone must have forged." "Don't." The Mafia boss's voice dropped to something colder. "Don't insult my intelligence by lying when we both know the truth." He slid another document across. Then another. Bank records showing payments from Costello Hospitality Group to Summit Food Services. Transfer records showing those payments being moved to offshore accounts. Email exchanges between Mike and the shell company's registered agent, emails sent from Mike's company account. Mike's face went from white to gray. "Where did you get these? Does it matter?" The Mafia boss leaned back in his chair. "You've been stealing from me for 8 months. Inflating vendor costs, skimming percentages, funneling money through fake companies. The total is approximately $473,000. Jenny hadn't known the full amount until that moment. Nearly $500,000. Her stomach turned. "I can explain," Mike said, his voice desperate now. "The vendors were legitimate. I was just. There were upcharges for expedited delivery, and..." "Stop talking." The Mafia boss's voice cut through Mike's explanation like a knife. He pulled out a small digital recorder and placed it on the table. "Would you like to hear yourself explain the real plan? This was recorded 6 weeks ago." He pressed play. Mike's voice crackled through the speaker, telling you, "This is the perfect setup. The old man thinks he's untouchable. Thinks nobody would dare move against his kid." Jenny watched the color drain completely from Mike's face as he listened to his own voice plotting, scheming, explaining exactly how he planned to provoke the Mafia boss into a public incident. "The play is I make a scene. Embarrass the kid, push hard enough that the old man has to react. He loses his temper in public, gets violent in front of witnesses. That's the kind of footage the feds would love to have." The Mafia boss stopped the recording. The silence in the room was absolute. "You used my son as bait," the Mafia boss said quietly. "You deliberately targeted an 8-year-old boy, traumatized him, tried to drag him out of a restaurant, all to provoke me into doing something that would destroy everything I've built." "No, Mike was shaking now. "I didn't actually hurt him. You just what?" For the first time, something dangerous flickered in the Mafia boss's expression. "You just terrorized a child who's already lost his mother? You just tried to use his fear as a weapon against me?" "It was business," Mike said desperately. "Just business. Nothing personal. I was trying to. Business." The Mafia boss repeated the word like he was tasting something foul. "You think that makes it better?" He pulled out another document. Jenny recognized it, the surveillance photos from the warehouse meeting. Mike with the Calabrese soldiers. Mike handing over the messenger bag. Mike shaking hands with Vincent Calabrese's nephew. "Monday night," the Mafia boss said. "You met with the Calabrese family. You sold them supplier lists, protection payment schedules, and information about my son's school and security rotations. What were they paying you?" Mike opened his mouth. Closed it. No sound came out. 5%, the Mafia boss answered his own question. 5% of whatever they made when they moved on my territory. That's what you sold my son's safety for. 5%. "They weren't going to hurt him," Mike said, his voice barely a whisper. "They just wanted leverage. They just wanted information that would let them kidnap him." The Mafia boss's voice was still quiet, but now it carried an edge that made Jenny's survival instinct scream. That would let them threaten him? Use him as a bargaining chip? No. I swear, I didn't. You didn't think. The Mafia boss stood, and Mike flinched backward in his chair. That's your problem, Mike. You saw an opportunity to make money and you didn't think about consequences. You didn't think about the fact that you were putting a child in danger. You didn't think about what it means to betray someone who's been generous enough to employ you despite your history of failure and abuse. He walked around the table slowly, deliberately, until he was standing behind Mike's chair. You know what the worst part is? The Mafia boss said softly. If you'd just asked for help, I would have given it to you. If you'd come to me and said you were in debt, you needed money, you were desperate, would have helped you. That's what I do for my people. I protect them. Mike was crying now, silent tears running down his face. But you didn't ask for help. You decided to steal. To betray. To put my son in danger for your own profit. The Mafia boss walked back to his seat and sat down. So now we're going to talk about consequences. Mike's voice came out strangled. What are you going to do to me? The Mafia boss looked at him for a long moment. Jenny half expected him to signal his security, to have Mike dragged away to whatever dark fate awaited traitors in this world. Instead, the Mafia boss said, nothing. Mike blinked. What? I'm not going to do anything to you, Mike. The Mafia boss's voice was perfectly calm. I'm not going to have you hurt. I'm not going to have you threatened. I'm not going to touch you at all. Mike looked confused, like he couldn't process what he was hearing. I don't understand. I know you don't. The Mafia boss leaned forward. See, you expected violence. You expected me to react the way men in my position are supposed to react when they're betrayed. With anger. With revenge. With blood. He paused. But I'm not going to do any of that. Instead, I'm going to do something much simpler. I'm going to erase you. Mike's confusion deepened. Erase me? Every business you apply to will hear about your theft. Every reference check will lead back to documentation of your embezzlement. Every job interview will end with questions about why you were fired from your last position. The Mafia boss's voice never rose above conversational. The Calabrese family will learn that you were caught, that everything you sold them was compromised, that anyone who trusted your information is now exposed. They'll handle you in their own way. Mike's face went ash white. No. Please. They'll do what people like that do to informants who get caught. The Mafia boss stood. You wanted to play in this world, Mike. You wanted to make deals with dangerous people. Now you get to live with the consequences. Please, Mike was begging now, openly weeping. Please, I'll give the money back. I'll disappear. You will disappear, the Mafia boss agreed. But not because I'm making you. Because there's nowhere left for you to go. He looked at his security. Escort Mr. George out. Make sure he understands that if I see him anywhere near my businesses, my family, or my city again, my restraint ends. The security moved forward. Mike stood on shaking legs, looking desperately between Jenny and the Mafia boss. This is because of her, isn't it? Mike said suddenly, pointing at Jenny. This is because she got in the way at the diner. If she'd just minded her own business, none of this. No, the Mafia boss interrupted. This is because you thought hurting a child was an acceptable business strategy. This is because you betrayed people who trusted you. This is because you're a coward who sells other people's safety for profit. He walked to the window, looking out over the city. Jenny just made sure I found out about it before you could do any more damage. She didn't cause this, Mike. You did. The security took Mike by the arms. He didn't resist. He was crying too hard to resist. As they led him to the door, Mike looked back one more time. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm sorry about the boy. I didn't mean to. Yes, you did, the Mafia boss said without turning around. That's the worst part. You meant every bit of it. The door closed behind them. Jenny stood frozen, her heart still racing, her mind struggling to process everything she'd just witnessed. She'd expected violence. Expected threats. Expected something out of a movie about organized crime. Instead, she'd watched a man be systematically dismantled with nothing but words and documentation. The Mafia boss turned from the window. Are you all right? Jenny realized she was shaking. I don't know. Is it really over? The part involving Mike George is over. The Mafia boss walked back to the table and gathered the documents. But we still have to deal with Diane and whoever else was involved in the vendor fraud. That's next week's problem. What about the Calabrese family? They'll get a message. They'll understand that their information source has been compromised and that any move they make based on what Mike gave them will be anticipated. His voice was calm, like he was discussing restaurant supply orders instead of organized crime rivalries. They'll back off. For now. Jenny sank into one of the chairs, her legs suddenly unable to hold her weight. I thought there would be violence. There will be, the Mafia boss said quietly. Just not here. Not now. And not from me. He looked at her. You did well today, Miss Matt. Better than I expected. I didn't do anything. I just stood here. You stood here when you could have run. You faced Mike when you could have hidden behind me. You followed through on something dangerous because it was the right thing to do. The Mafia boss smiled slightly. That's worth more than you know. Jenny looked up at him, this man who'd taken a scared waitress and turned her into someone who could face down corruption and betrayal. What happens now? She asked. The Mafia boss walked to the door. Now we go see my son. He's been asking about you all week. And somehow, after everything. The confrontation, the fear, the dismantling of a man who tried to destroy everything, that simple statement made Jenny's eyes sting with unexpected tears. Because in the end, this hadn't been about money or power or revenge. It had been about protecting a child. And that was something worth fighting for. 3 weeks later, Jenny stood in the ballroom of the Riverside Hotel, one of the Mafia boss's properties. Watching 200 employees file in for what had been billed as a mandatory company meeting. Managers, servers, kitchen staff, maintenance workers. People from all 12 diner locations and a dozen other businesses under the Costello Hospitality Group umbrella. They looked nervous. Mandatory meetings in this organization usually meant one of two things: someone was getting promoted, or someone was getting fired. And given the rumors that had been circulating about Mike George's sudden disappearance and Diane's abrupt resignation, most people were expecting the latter. Jenny stood off to the side of the small stage, wearing a navy blazer she'd bought specifically for this occasion. Her hands were shaking slightly, but she kept them clasped in front of her where no one could see. The Mafia boss entered from a side door, and the room went instantly quiet. He moved to the podium with that same unhurried confidence Jenny had seen in the diner that first day, the walk of a man who'd never questioned his right to occupy space. Thank you all for coming, he said, his voice carrying easily through the room. I know this was short notice, and I appreciate your flexibility. He paused, looking out over the assembled employees. 3 weeks ago, we discovered systematic fraud in our vendor relations department. Money was being stolen through fake companies, inflated invoices, and falsified records. The total theft exceeded $470,000 over 8 months. A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. People exchanged glances, whispered to each other. The people responsible have been removed from the organization, the Mafia boss continued. But their removal isn't why I called this meeting. I called this meeting because their theft was only possible due to failures in our oversight systems. Failures that I, as the owner of this company, am ultimately responsible for. Jenny watched the employees' faces. This wasn't what they'd expected. Leaders in this world didn't admit fault. They didn't take responsibility. They blamed, they punished, they moved on. We failed to create an environment where employees felt safe reporting concerns, the Mafia boss said. We failed to establish clear channels for accountability. We failed to protect the people who work hard every day to make this company successful. He gestured toward Jenny. 3 weeks ago, one of our newest employees uncovered this fraud. She did so by asking questions, by refusing to accept answers that didn't make sense, and by taking personal risks to expose the truth. She did this not because it was her job, she'd only been here 2 weeks. But because she understood something fundamental, that protecting people is more important than protecting profits. Jenny felt every eye in the room turn toward her. Her face flushed hot. This is Jenny Matt, the Mafia boss continued. Some of you may remember her from Riverside Diner, where she worked as a waitress. Some of you may have heard about what happened there, about how she defended a child from an abusive manager and was fired for it. The room was absolutely silent now. I'm here today to announce a restructuring of our employee protection policies. Effective immediately, we're establishing a new department dedicated to workplace safety, fair treatment, and accountability. This department will have the authority to investigate complaints, review management decisions, and implement changes across all our properties. The Mafia boss looked directly at Jenny. And I'm promoting Miss Matt to Director of Employee Protection. She'll report directly to me, and she'll have my full support in making whatever changes are necessary to ensure that what happened at Riverside, both the abuse and the theft, never happens again. The applause started slowly, then built. Jenny saw people standing, clapping, some of them smiling. She recognized faces from Riverside, Maria, Dolores, even the line cook who'd gossiped about the Mafia boss that first day. This organization was built on the principle that we protect our people, the Mafia boss said when the applause died down. Sometimes we forget that. Sometimes we let fear, or profit, or convenience override what we know is right. Miss Matt reminded me what it looks like to choose courage over comfort. To do the right thing even when it costs you something. He stepped away from the podium. That's all. Department heads will receive detailed memos about the new policies by end of day. Anyone with questions or concerns can direct them to Miss Matt's office. Thank you. The meeting dispersed slowly. People approached Jenny, some to congratulate her, some to ask questions, some just to shake her hand and say they were glad someone was finally paying attention to the problems they'd been too afraid to report. When the room finally cleared, Jenny found herself alone with the Mafia boss near the stage. That was. She struggled to find words. That was not what I expected. What did you expect? I don't know. Something quieter. Less public. Change has to be public to be real, the Mafia boss said. If I'd just promoted you quietly, given you an office and a title, people would have assumed it was a reward for loyalty or something else. They needed to understand why this matters. They needed to hear that protecting employees is a priority, not an inconvenience. Jenny looked at him. You really meant all of that? About failing them? I did. His expression was serious. I built this company believing that strength meant control, that respect meant fear. But my son hiding behind you in that diner taught me something I should have known already. Real strength is making people feel safe. Real respect comes from protection, not intimidation. And the criminal world? Jenny asked quietly. The Calabrese family, the people who expected violence, what do they think about all this? They're confused, the Mafia boss admitted. They expected me to react with force. Expected Mike to disappear permanently. Expected a show of power. He almost smiled. Instead they got corporate restructuring and employee protection policies. It's not what they're used to. Is that dangerous? Maybe. Or maybe it's smart. He looked out at the empty ballroom. Fear only works until someone stops being afraid. But if people trust you, if they believe you'll protect them, they'll walk through fire for you. That's a different kind of power. A better kind. The side door opened, and Marco appeared with his security guard. The boy looked around the empty ballroom, then spotted Jenny and his father. "Is it over?" Marco asked, walking toward them. "Just finished," the Mafia boss said. Marco looked up at Jenny. "Did you get promoted?" "I did." "Good." Marco's face was serious. "You deserve it. You're brave." Jenny crouched down to his level. "You know what? I was terrified. I'm still terrified. But you did it anyway," Marco said. "That's what makes it brave." He smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes and transformed his whole face. Jenny realized it was the first time she'd seen him smile since that day in the diner. The first time he'd looked like a child instead of a small adult carrying too much weight. The Mafia boss noticed too. She saw something shift in his expression, something softer than she'd ever seen there before. "Marco," he said quietly. "Why don't you go with Danny and get some ice cream? Miss Matt and I need to finish talking." Marco nodded and headed toward the door with his guard. But he looked back once, still smiling, and waved. When he was gone, the Mafia boss stood silent for a long moment. "Thank you," he said finally. "For what?" "For giving me that." He gestured toward the door Marco had left through. "For reminding me what I'm supposed to be protecting. It's not the businesses or the territory or the reputation. It's him. His childhood. His ability to smile and trust people and believe that the world can be good." Jenny felt her throat tighten. "You would have figured that out eventually." "Maybe. But maybe not before I lost him completely." The Mafia boss looked at her. "You stepped between him and someone who was hurting him, and you did it without knowing who I was or what I could do for you. That's the kind of person I want running employee protection in this company. Someone who acts on principle instead of calculation." "I just did what anyone should do," Jenny said. "But most people don't." He extended his hand. "Welcome to your new position, Director Matt. I have a feeling you're going to make a lot of changes around here." Jenny shook his hand, feeling the weight of responsibility settling onto her shoulders. 2 months ago she'd been a waitress struggling to pay rent. Now she was running a department with real authority to change people's lives. All because she'd refused to let a child be hurt. "I won't let you down," she said. "I know you won't." The Mafia boss headed toward the door, then paused. "And Jenny? Thank you. Not as your boss. As a father. Thank you for protecting my son when I couldn't." He left before she could respond. Jenny stood alone in the empty ballroom, sunlight streaming through the tall windows, and thought about everything that had led to this moment. A spilled drink. A cruel manager. A scared child. One decision made in seconds that had changed everything. She pulled out her phone and looked at the last message from her anonymous informant. It had come that morning. "You did well. The Empire is safer because of you. Some of us have been waiting years for someone like you to appear. Keep asking questions. Keep protecting people. And remember, true power isn't about making people fear you. It's about making them know you'll protect them." Jenny had tried to respond, to ask who they were, but the number was disconnected. She suspected she'd never know their identity. Maybe that was better. Maybe some heroes preferred to work in shadows. She looked around the ballroom one more time, this space that had just witnessed a public declaration that protection mattered more than profit, that courage mattered more than compliance, that one person standing up for what was right could reshape an entire organization. The criminal underworld had expected violence. They'd gotten corporate reform instead. And somehow, that was more powerful than any show of force could have been. Jenny walked toward the exit, her footsteps echoing in the empty space, and thought about Marco's smile. About the employees who'd approached her with hope in their eyes. About the Mafia boss choosing legacy over fear. One act of courage in a roadside diner had reshaped an empire. And Jenny Matt, former waitress, current director of employee protection, was just getting started. Because true power, she'd learned, wasn't about control or fear or dominance. True power was protecting the innocent. Everything else was just noise. In a world built on fear, one waitress proved that courage could be contagious. That standing up for a child could expose corruption. That doing the right thing, even when it cost everything, could change not just one life but hundreds. Mike George disappeared into obscurity, his name a warning whispered in back offices about the cost of betrayal. The Calabrese family backed away, unwilling to test a man who'd proven that restraint could be more frightening than violence. Marco started speaking more, smiling more, trusting more, slowly becoming the child he should have been all along. And Jenny Matt, who'd once served coffee to people who didn't remember her name, now had the power to protect people who'd spent years being invisible. All because she refused to let a child be hurt. One act of courage. One empire reshaped. One choice that proved true power isn't about making people fear you, it's about making them know you'll protect them. If you're ready for the explosion coming in the next story, smash subscribe, hit like, and stay close for more mind-blowing and exciting stories.